The morning of July 23rd, 1944, somewhere south of St. Lo, Staff Sergeant Michael "Red" Donovan crouched behind his Sherman M4A3, a welding torch hissing blue flame in his calloused hands. The air tasted of hot metal and diesel. Around him, the bocage country of Normandy stretched like a green maze, each hedgerow a fortress, each gap a grave. He was building something the army hadn't authorized, something his commanders might court-martial him for, something that might save his life. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sandbags came first, 50 of them, each stuffed with Norman soil still damp from yesterday's rain. His crew had spent 3 hours arranging them across the glacis plate, creating a sloped wall that angled outward at roughly 45 degrees from the tank's already sloped front armor. Behind the sandbags, welded to the hull with crude but sturdy beads, spare track links formed a lattice of steel. It looked absurd. It looked desperate. It looked like hope. "Sarge, you really think this is going to stop an 88? Private Danny Walsh asked, his voice tight with the kind of fear that 3 weeks in the hedgerows had branded into every tanker's bones. Donovan didn't answer right away. He'd seen what an 88mm anti-tank gun could do. 2 days earlier, Lieutenant Morrison's tank had taken a hit from one at 1,500 meters. The shell punched through the frontal armor like it was paper, tore through the fighting compartment, and set off the ammunition. Morrison and his crew never had time to scream. The Sherman burned for 6 hours. The smell still clung to Donovan's uniform. "It ain't for 88s, Donovan finally said, his torch cutting through another section of steel. "It's for the Panzerfaust, the 88s. Well, if one of those finds us, we're cooked anyway." This was the truth that every Sherman crew in Normandy had learned by the summer of 1944. The German Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck hollow-charge weapons were killing Allied armor at a rate that made generals nervous and tankers terrified. In September of that year, roughly 4% of U.S. tank losses would be attributed to these handheld rockets. By October, that number would climb to 12.5%. By November, 14.5%. The infantry anti-tank weapon had become the Sherman's greatest fear. The irony was bitter. The M4 Sherman had been designed as a reliable, mobile, mass-producible medium tank. It was never meant to slug it out with German heavy armor in open combat. Its frontal glacis plate, 51mm thick and angled at 56 degrees from vertical, provided an effective thickness of roughly 91mm. Against the standard German 75mm Puck 40 anti-tank gun, this was adequate protection at moderate ranges. German testing later confirmed that even the Tiger I's 88mm gun couldn't penetrate a Sherman's upper glacis if the tank was angled 30 degrees away. But in the bocage, angles didn't matter. Combat happened at conversational distances. A Panzerfaust could penetrate 200mm of armor from 30 meters. The Panzerschreck, firing an 88mm caliber hollow-charge warhead, could pierce even more. These weren't kinetic penetrators that relied on mass and velocity. They were shaped charges, weapons that formed a superheated jet of metal capable of burning through steel like a cutting torch through butter. Sergeant Donovan understood this in his gut, if not in technical terms. He'd watched a Panzerfaust team emerge from a hedgerow gap 40 meters away and fire at Tech Sergeant Kowalski's tank. The rocket hit the side sponson where the ammunition was stored. The explosion was immediate, catastrophic. 3 men died, inside. 2 made it out, but burns covering 40% of their bodies. Kowalski was one of them. He died 3 days later in a field hospital, calling for his mother. That's when Donovan started welding. The idea wasn't original. All across the American front, tank crews were improvising armor using whatever materials they could scavenge. Some units welded spare track links to their hulls, others mounted logs, planks, even concrete. The philosophy was simple: create standoff distance between the warhead and the actual armor. If a shaped charge detonated against a sandbag 6 inches away from the hull, maybe, just maybe, the jet wouldn't form properly. Maybe it would dissipate before reaching the real armor. Maybe. The United States Army was not enthusiastic about these field modifications. In the summer of 1944, General George S. Patton, informed by his ordnance officers that sandbags provided negligible protection and placed excessive strain on the Sherman's suspension and drivetrain, banned their use throughout the Third Army. Patton's reasoning was sound from an engineering perspective. Each sandbag weighed approximately 50 pounds when wet. A typical installation used 50 to 70 bags, adding 2,500 to 3,500 pounds of dead weight to a tank already pushing the limits of its powertrain. The extra weight caused premature transmission failures, reduced mobility, and increased fuel consumption by nearly 20%. But Patton's order was issued from headquarters, not from the driver's seat of a Sherman in the bocage. The men who lived inside these steel boxes had different priorities. Mobility mattered, but survival mattered more. By mid-July, entire companies of the 1st U.S. Army had begun adding expedient armor to their vehicles. The designs varied. Some crews simply stacked sandbags against the front hull. Others built elaborate wooden frames to hold the bags in place. The most sophisticated installations, like the one Sergeant Donovan was constructing, combined multiple layers, welded track links providing a first barrier, sandbags creating standoff distance, and camouflage netting holding everything together. The 9th Army took the concept further, developing a standardized composite armor package. First, spare Sherman track links were welded across the hull and turret. Then, sandbags were layered over the links. Finally, camouflage netting was stretched taut to keep everything secure. The installation took 6 hours and required the efforts of an entire platoon, but the psychological effect was immediate. Crews reported feeling significantly more confident facing German infantry anti-tank teams. The question, of course, was whether any of it actually worked. Technical Sergeant James Hendricks of the Ordnance Department had been asking himself this same question since early January 1945. By then, the practice of sandbagging tanks had become so widespread that the Army could no longer ignore it. If thousands of tankers believed sandbags saved lives, the Army needed to know if they were right. On March 9, 1945, officers of the 1st Armoured Group conducted the only systematic test of sandbag armour known to have been performed during the war. The location was somewhere in Germany, the exact site lost to history. The weapon was a standard Panzerfaust 60, captured from German forces. The target was a sandbagged M4 Sherman that had been knocked out in previous fighting and recovered for testing purposes. The results were mixed and troubling. When fired at the side of the Sherman, where the armour was only 38mm thick and vertical, the Panzerfaust warhead blew the sandbags away like leaves in a hurricane. The jet formed perfectly, penetrated the side armour, and would have killed everyone inside if the tank had been occupied. The sandbags, in this configuration, provided zero protection, but when the testers fired at the frontal glacis at an oblique angle, something different happened. The warhead detonated against the sandbags, blowing away some of them but failing to penetrate the underlying armour. Whether this was due to the standoff distance, the disruption of the jet formation, or simply the inherent strength of the glacis plate at that angle remained unclear. The testers couldn't determine if the sandbags helped or if the armour would have resisted the warhead anyway. The official report concluded with careful language. If the bags did nothing more, one observer wrote, they were certainly a morale factor as the crews were thoroughly impressed with them. Morale factor. That phrase would haunt the debate for decades. Were sandbags actual armour or merely psychological armour? And did the distinction matter if crews fought more effectively when they believed they were protected? Back in Normandy, on that July morning, Sergeant Donovan didn't have access to test reports or engineering analyses. He had instinct, fear, and the memory of friends burning alive. He stepped back from his work and surveyed what he'd built. The sandbags formed a rough wedge across the Sherman's front, angled outward. The track links created a dark lattice beneath. It looked crude, improvised, desperate. "Think it'll hold?" Walsh asked again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Donovan pulled off his welding gloves and wiped sweat from his forehead. The sun was climbing, burning off the morning mist. Somewhere to the south, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. In an hour, maybe two, they'd be ordered forward into the hedgerows again, into the maze where every turn might hide a Panzerfaust team. "It'll hold together," Donovan said. "Whether it stops anything, we'll find out." What Sergeant Donovan and thousands like him couldn't know, was that they were participating in one of history's most widespread field experiments in battlefield psychology. The sandbags didn't work against 88mm guns. They couldn't. The kinetic energy of a full-caliber armor-piercing round fired at high velocity would blow through sandbags, track links, and the Sherman's frontal armor without meaningful resistance. But the 88s, terrifying as they weren't the primary threat in the close-quarters fighting of the bocage. The real killers were the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, and against these weapons, the science was genuinely unclear. Shaped charges relied on precise geometry and standoff distance to function optimally. Disrupt that geometry, alter that distance, and the penetration performance degraded, sometimes dramatically, sometimes not at all. The variables were too complex for field conditions to predict. Distance from armor, angle of impact, type of material struck, humidity, temperature, whether the warhead struck a hard or soft surface first. This uncertainty created a psychological phenomenon that military historians would later recognize as protective ritual. Tank crews engaging in sandbagging weren't necessarily making their vehicles more survivable in a measurable way. They were taking action against an unpredictable threat, asserting control over circumstances that felt uncontrollable. The act of welding, stacking, securing, these became rituals of survival, transforming passive targets into active participants in their own defense. And sometimes, just sometimes, the sandbags actually worked. Corporal Eddie Martinez of the 14th Armored Division encountered a Panzerfaust team near Aachen in late January 1945. His Sherman, heavily sandbagged according to division practice, took a hit on the right front sponson. The warhead detonated against the bags. Martinez felt the concussion, saw sandbags blown across the street, watched smoke pour from the impact site. He ordered his driver to reverse immediately, expecting fire, expecting death. Nothing happened. When they examined the tank later, they found the sponson, armor scorched but unpenetrated, a shallow crater marked where the warhead had struck. Whether the sandbags had disrupted the jet formation or the crew had simply gotten lucky remained impossible to determine. Martinez didn't care. He immediately ordered more sandbags added to his tank. This was the reality of armor improvisation in 1944 and 1945. Not clean test results, but messy anecdotes. Not engineering certainty, but battlefield ambiguity. Some crews swore sandbags saved their lives. Others watched friends die in heavily sandbagged tanks and concluded the whole practice was theatre. Both groups had evidence. Neither could prove causation. The German response to American sandbagging efforts provides insight into how the Wehrmacht viewed this improvised armor. German tactical reports from late 1944 noted the increasing prevalence of modified American tanks but didn't express particular concern. Panzerfaust crews were instructed to aim for the sides or rear of enemy tanks whenever possible, advice that would have been given regardless of whether the fronts were sandbagged. If German infantry had believed sandbags significantly degraded the Panzerfaust's effectiveness, doctrinal adjustments would have appeared. None did. This suggests that from the German perspective, sandbags weren't a game-changing defensive measure. They were, at best, a minor inconvenience that occasionally disrupted optimal shot placement. Yet the American practice continued and even intensified. By February 1945, after the Battle of the Bulge, even General Patton reversed his position. The clamour for better protection had become too loud to ignore. But Patton, true to form, demanded a better solution than sandbags. His order was simple and brutal. Take armour from knocked-out tanks, American or German, cut it to size, and weld it to operational Shermans. This produced the so-called field-modified or up-armoured Shermans that became common in the Third Army during the final months of the war. Approximately 36 tanks per armored division received additional armor plates salvaged from destroyed vehicles. These modifications provided genuine, measurable protection against German 75mm anti-tank guns and even some 88mm guns at longer ranges, protection that sandbags could never offer. The welded armor plates represented the proper engineering solution. They added weight, yes, but weight that genuinely enhanced survivability against kinetic penetrators. They were, in effect, what tankers had been hoping sandbags would be. But Patton's solution came too late for most Sherman crews in Normandy, and it required resources, time, and industrial facilities that frontline units simply didn't have. Sandbagging could be done in an afternoon with materials scrounged from the local area. Welding armor plates required cranes, cutting torches, skilled welders, and access to knocked-out tanks in recoverable positions. For units already in contact with the enemy, sandbags were the only option available. Sergeant Donovan's Sherman rolled out at 0900 hours on July 23rd. The bags were secured, the welds were crude but solid. As they moved through a gap in the hedgerows, Donovan could feel the extra weight. The transmission groaned on inclines. Fuel consumption was noticeably higher. The tank felt sluggish, less responsive. But when they passed the burned-out hulk of Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman, still smouldering 3 days after it was hit, Donovan ran his hand across the sandbags and felt something like comfort. Maybe they worked, maybe they didn't, but he'd done something. He'd fought back against the waiting, the helplessness, the knowledge that at any moment a weapon he couldn't see might turn his tank into a coffin of flame. That night, after 12 hours of combat in which his tank wasn't hit, Donovan added more sandbags. The psychological impact of sandbagging extended beyond individual tank crews. At the company and battalion level, commanders observed that units using improvised armor exhibited slightly better performance in urban and close-quarters combat situations. Whether this was due to actual protection or simply increased crew confidence remained unclear, but the effect was real enough to be noted in after-action reports. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bradley of the 2nd Armored Division wrote in his assessment of bocage fighting, "The men believe the sandbags help. Whether they do or not in a technical sense is less important than the fact that crews in sandbagged tanks press attacks more aggressively and hold defensive positions more tenaciously. Whatever the engineering reality, the psychological reality is that improvised armor makes better soldiers." This observation cuts to the heart of why sandbag armor persisted despite unclear evidence of effectiveness. War is not merely a technical problem, it's a human problem. And humans fighting in confined steel boxes against weapons designed specifically to kill them needed more than statistics and test data. They needed to believe they had a chance. The story of Sherman tank crews welding sandbags at various angles and hoping to deflect incoming fire is ultimately a story about the limits of industrial warfare and the persistence of human agency. The United States had built the most sophisticated logistical system in human history. It could deliver thousands of tanks across an ocean and keep them fueled, armed, and operational, but it couldn't protect the men inside those tanks from every threat. That gap between industrial capacity and individual vulnerability created space for improvisation, superstition, and ritual. The sandbags rarely stopped 88mm rounds. The title's suggestion that they could deflect such weapons is, at best, aspirational, but they might, under specific circumstances, have degraded the technical effectiveness of shaped charge weapons. And in a war where survival often came down to luck and inches, might was enough. As the summer of 1944 bled into autumn, and autumn into the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, sandbagged Shermans became a common sight across the Western Front. Some were crude affairs, a few bags tossed on the glacis. Others were elaborate fortresses, layers of steel, sand, wood, and even concrete, transforming the tank into something that looked more like a mobile pillbox than a maneuverable fighting vehicle. Engineers calculated the strain on suspensions. Ordnance officers filed reports about premature failures. Generals issued orders both permitting and banning the practice, sometimes in the same army depending on who was in command. And through it all, the men kept welding and stacking and hoping, building armor not just against German weapons but against the terrible uncertainty of modern war, where death could come from any angle, at any moment, delivered by a weapon that cost 25 Reichsmarks to manufacture and could destroy a tank worth $50,000. The sandbags were, in the end, an expression of faith, not in their physical properties, which were doubtful, but in the human need to do something, anything, when faced with forces beyond control. On November 12, 1944, Sergeant Michael Donovan's luck ran out. His heavily sandbagged Sherman took an 88mm round from a concealed position near Metz. The shell penetrated the glacis between the driver's hatches, blew through the fighting compartment, and ignited the ammunition. Donovan and 4 crewmen died instantly. The sandbags did nothing to stop it. They were never meant to. But Private Danny Walsh, who'd asked if the bags would stop an 88 back in July, survived 2 more months of combat in a replacement tank that he immediately sandbagged. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the Rhine crossing. He came home to Philadelphia in August 1945 and never spoke about the war, except to say, once, to his son, "We did what we could." That phrase, simple and true, captures the essence of the sandbag story. Against hollow charge weapons, under specific conditions, at oblique angles, with proper standoff distance, the bags might have helped. Against kinetic penetrators, against 88s and Panthers and Tigers, they were useless. But the men didn't know which weapon would find them. So they welded and stacked and hoped, and sometimes, just sometimes, hope was enough to get them through another day. The winter of 1944 arrived with teeth. The Ardennes forest transformed into a frozen labyrinth where diesel froze in fuel lines and men's breath crystallized on gun sights. Sergeant Frank Kowalski, no relation to the tech sergeant who died in July, commanded a Sherman M4, a 376mm gun tank in the 4th Armored Division. His tank wore armor like a night wore mail, layers upon layers of improvised protection that made ordnance officers wince and made his crew sleep slightly better at night. The sandbagging had evolved by December. What began as desperate expedients in Normandy had become almost standardized practice in some units. Kowalski's tank featured the 9th Army's composite design, track links welded to the hull, sandbags packed behind them, all held in place by cargo netting requisitioned from supply drops. The configuration added nearly 2 tons to the Sherman's combat weight. The transmission groaned, the fuel consumption was terrible, and every man in the crew believed it kept them alive. They called the tank Warsaw Warrior, painted in crude white letters on the turret. Kowalski's grandfather had emigrated from Poland in 1903. Now, 41 years later, his grandson was fighting to liberate Europe in a tank wrapped in sandbags and faith. The German offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge shattered the quiet of the Ardennes on December 16th. Through fog and snow, 3 German armies crashed into thinly held American positions. Panzers emerged from the forest like iron ghosts. Infantry armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks infiltrated American lines. The fighting devolved into the kind of close-quarters chaos where improvised armor might actually matter. Kowalski's platoon was near Bastogne when the offensive hit. They'd been resting, performing maintenance, writing letters home. The first indication that something was wrong came from radio traffic, frantic calls for support, reports of German tanks penetrating deep into American rear areas. Then the refugees appeared, American infantry streaming back from positions that no longer existed, their eyes carrying the hollow look of men who'd seen something they couldn't quite process. "Mount up," Lieutenant Breslin ordered. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he climbed into his own Sherman. "We're moving to blocking positions south of the town." Warsaw Warrior rumbled to life, the Ford GAA engine's familiar roar cutting through the frozen air. The extra weight was immediately apparent as they climbed a shallow grade. The tank that had been nimble in July now moved like a pregnant elephant. But it moved, and in the chaos of those first hours, moving at all put them ahead of units that had been overrun before they could react. They set up in a small village whose name Kowalski never learned. The position offered fields of fire across open ground where the forest gave way to farmland. It was good tank country, the kind of terrain where the Sherman's gun could engage at medium ranges, and its mobility, what remained of it under all that weight, could be used to advantage. The Germans came at dusk, Panzer IVs, 3 of them, advancing in a loose wedge formation. Behind them, infantry in winter camouflage, nearly invisible against the snow. Kowalski spotted them at 800 meters through a gap in the falling snow. Gunner, Panzers, 11 o'clock, 800 meters, he called down to Corporal Jimmy Hayes, who was already traversing the turret. Identified, Hayes responded, his eye pressed to the sight. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. Warsaw Warrior fired 7 rounds. Hayes was good, very good, and the 76mm M1A1 gun, while inferior to German weapons, could penetrate a Panzer IV frontally at this range. The lead German tank took a hit to the turret and stopped, smoke pouring from hatches. The second tank got off 2 shots that both missed, then took a round through the driver's vision port. The third tank reversed rapidly and disappeared into the tree line, but the infantry kept coming. This was where the sandbags were supposed to prove their worth. German infantry doctrine in the Ardennes emphasized the use of Panzerfaust teams to neutralize American armor. The weapon was cheap, required minimal training, and in the hands of a brave or desperate soldier could kill any tank in the American infantry. By December of 1944, German industry was producing Panzerfausts faster than it could produce tanks. Every infantry unit had them. Some soldiers carried 2. Kowalski watched through his vision blocks as white-clad figures darted between buildings, moving closer. The machine guns chattered, Hayes on the coaxial 70 caliber, the loader manning the bow gun, Kowalski himself working the turret-mounted 50 caliber. The noise inside the tank was overwhelming, a hammering cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. Then he saw the muzzle flash. A Panzerfaust, fired from a doorway, perhaps 40 meters away. The warhead traced a line of smoke through the falling snow, moving impossibly fast and impossibly slow simultaneously. Time compressed. Kowalski had a moment to think, this is it, and then the warhead struck. The explosion felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The entire tank rocked. Sandbags flew apart, sand and burlap spraying across the glacis. Smoke filled Kowalski's vision. He heard Hayes screaming something, couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. "Status!" Kowalski shouted. "Gunner, loader, driver, report!" "I'm good," Hayes called back. "Good here." The loader, Private Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant who died in July. "Driver's good," came the reply from below. No fire, no penetration. They were alive. Kowalski looked out through the smoke and saw the wreckage of their sandbag armor. The Panzerfaust had hit low, near where the glacis met the hull floor. The bags in that section were simply gone, disintegrated by the blast. But the hull armor beneath showed only scoring, no hole, no penetration. Had the sandbags helped, or had the Panzerfaust simply hit at a poor angle, striking the already heavily sloped glacis in a way that would have failed to penetrate even without the improvised armor? Kowalski would never know. What he did know was that he was alive, his crew was alive, and they could still fight. "Load high explosive," he ordered. "We're putting that building down." The 76mm gun boomed. The building where the Panzerfaust team had hidden disappeared in a cloud of brick dust and timber. Whether the soldier who'd fired the rocket survived, Kowalski never learned. The infantry attack broke apart under concentrated machine gun fire, German soldiers withdrawing into the forest. That night, as snow fell and the temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, Kowalski's crew worked by moonlight to restore their sandbag armor. They couldn't replace what had been destroyed, there were no spare bags, but they redistributed what remained, filling gaps, trying to maintain some semblance of protection. Their hands were numb with cold. The work took 3 hours. None of them complained. "Sarge," Private Morrison said as they worked, "you think it helped? The bags?" Kowalski had been asking himself the same question. He thought about the test that would be conducted 3 months later at the 1st Armoured Group, thought about conclusions he didn't yet know would be drawn, thought about the phrase morale factor that hadn't yet been written in a report he'd never read. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think it helped." Whether he believed this or simply needed to believe it was a question without a meaningful distinction. The Battle of the Bulge raged for 6 weeks. Allied forces, initially thrown back, stabilized the line and then counterattacked. Sherman tanks, many of them sandbagged, played crucial roles in holding key positions and breaking German armored thrusts. The fighting was brutal, conducted in weather that made Normandy seem pleasant by comparison. Tanks froze. Men froze. The dead stacked up in snowy fields, waiting for spring thaws to make burial possible. Through it all, the sandbagging continued. New crews arriving from England took one look at the combat-worn tanks and immediately began adding their own improvised armour. The practice had become almost ritualistic, a rite of passage that transformed a factory-fresh Sherman into a combat vehicle. Officers who had initially opposed sandbagging found themselves permitting it simply because the alternative was reduced crew morale. The engineering problems remained unresolved. Transmissions failed at accelerated rates. Suspensions collapsed under loads they weren't designed to carry. Final drives burned out. Ordnance reports documented a 25% increase in mechanical failures among heavily sandbagged tanks compared to unmodified vehicles. But these failures occurred in tanks that were still alive to fail, and that distinction mattered to the men inside them. Captain David Chen of the 7th Army's Ordnance Section found himself caught between competing realities. The engineering data clearly showed that sandbags provided marginal protection at best against shaped charge weapons, and no protection at all against kinetic penetrators. The added weight significantly degraded mechanical reliability and tactical mobility. From a purely technical standpoint, sandbags were a net negative that should be banned army-wide. But Chen had also read the after-action reports, the accounts from company commanders noting improved crew performance in sandbagged tanks. He'd interviewed survivors who swore sandbags had saved their lives. He'd seen photographs of sandbagged tanks with scorch marks where Panzerfausts had struck but failed to penetrate, though whether the sandbags deserved credit or the angle of impact did remain unclear. In February 1945, Chen wrote a memo that attempted to reconcile these contradictions. The technical effectiveness of expedient armor remains unproven, he concluded. However, the psychological benefit appears genuine and may contribute to overall combat effectiveness. Recommend that commanders be given discretion to permit sandbagging when tactical situations warrant, while continuing to emphasize proper mechanical maintenance to mitigate increased wear. It was the kind of carefully worded bureaucratic compromise that satisfied no one but allowed the practice to continue where commanders chose to permit it. General Patton's reversal on the sandbag question came in February, after the Bulge, but his solution reflected his engineering skepticism. Rather than sandbags, he ordered that armor plates be salvaged from knocked-out vehicles and welded to operational tanks. This was the field modification that Patton could support. Metal on metal, proper armor providing proven protection. The work fell to ordnance units already overwhelmed with battle damage repairs. 3 Belgian factories near Bastogne took on much of the load. Tanks would arrive, get measured for armor plates cut from destroyed vehicles, then receive welding work that took skilled technicians a full day per tank. The modified vehicles, with additional glacis protection and sometimes turret reinforcement, represented a genuine capability upgrade. They were heavier than sandbagged tanks but provided real protection against German 75mm guns and marginal protection against 88mm guns at longer ranges. Approximately 108 tanks across 3 armoured divisions received this treatment in the Third Army. It was the right solution from an engineering perspective, but it was also resource-intensive, time-consuming, and only available to a fraction of the Sherman force. For everyone else, sandbags remained the only option. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos of the 1st Army's Intelligence Section spent March and April 1945 analysing German tactical reports captured in the advance across Germany. What she found surprised her. German after-action reports mentioned American tank modifications rarely, and when they did, the tone was more curious than concerned. One report from the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division noted, American tanks increasingly covered with miscellaneous materials, including sandbags, spare tracks, and wooden planks. Panzerfaust effectiveness appears unchanged. Recommend continued targeting of side and rear aspects when possible. The phrase effectiveness appears unchanged was telling. If sandbags had significantly degraded Panzerfaust performance, German tactical doctrine would have adapted. Crews would have been instructed to expend multiple rockets per tank or to aim for specific weak points where sandbags couldn't be mounted. The absence of such guidance suggested that from the German perspective, sandbags were more cosmetic than functional. But Santos also found anecdotal reports from individual soldiers. One Panzerfaust gunner wrote in a letter captured near the Rhine, "The American tanks now carry many sandbags on their fronts. Whether this stops our weapons I do not know, but it makes aiming more difficult as you cannot see the shape of the tank clearly. Perhaps this is their intention." This observation, from an enemy combatant with direct experience, hinted at an effect no test had measured. The visual disruption caused by sandbags might make it harder for anti-tank gunners to identify weak points in the Sherman's armor profile. A trained gunner knew to aim for the driver's hatches, the sponsons, the turret ring, vulnerable points that were normally easy to spot on the Sherman's clean geometric lines. Sandbags obscured these references, forcing gunners to estimate or simply aim for center mass. If true, this would represent a genuine tactical benefit that had nothing to do with the bag's physical protective properties and everything to do with their psychological effect on enemy gunners. But proving this hypothesis would require data that didn't exist and wouldn't exist until historians could analyze the war with decades of hindsight. By April 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. German forces, collapsing under pressure from both east and west, fought with the desperation of the doomed. Panzerfaust attacks intensified even as other forms of resistance crumbled. In urban combat, where every building might hide an anti-tank team, sandbagged Shermans became the norm rather than the exception. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, yet another Morrison in this story of repeating names, commanded a platoon of the 2nd Armoured Division during the drive into Germany proper. His tanks looked like mobile fortresses, every available surface covered with sandbags, track links, spare road wheels, wooden planks, and in one case, a cast-iron bathtub that the crew swore would stop a Panzerfaust. Whether it would or not remained untested, but the bathtub stayed mounted until the war's end. "We look like gypsies," Morrison told his company commander during an inspection, "but the men believe in it, and they're fighting well." The company commander, a Major Hood, survived since North Africa and seen every iteration of Sherman modification, simply nodded. "Keep them fighting," he said. "That's all that matters now." In the final weeks of the war, as German resistance fragmented and Allied forces overran position after position, the question of sandbag effectiveness became almost moot. The volume of combat decreased. The Germans ran out of Panzerfausts, or ran out of soldiers trained to use them, or simply ran out of will. Shermans that had survived months of combat with their improvised armor intact began to seem charmed, blessed by luck or God, or the accumulated prayers of desperate men. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Sergeant Frank Kowalski's Warsaw Warrior sat in a field near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, its sandbags weathered and torn, its paint faded, its track links welded armor rusted but intact. The crew gathered around their tank for a photograph, 5 men who'd survived the bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the final push into Germany. In the photograph, you can see the layers of improvised armor clearly, the sandbags sagging with months of exposure, the track links welded at angles that would make a proper engineer weep, the cargo netting torn in places but still holding everything together. It looks absurd, this mobile junkyard that was supposed to be a medium tank. It looks desperate and brave and human. None of the crew could say with certainty whether the sandbags had saved their lives. They'd taken small arms fire, shrapnel from near-miss artillery, and once, a Panzerfaust that had struck at such an angle that penetration would have been unlikely even without the bags. But they'd also seen friends die in equally protected tanks, seen rockets punch through improvised armor like it wasn't there, seen the randomness that governed survival in mechanized warfare. What they could say was that the sandbags had mattered to them, that the act of building protection, even protection of dubious value, had given them agency in a war where agency was rare, that believing they'd done something to improve their odds had made them better soldiers, more willing to press attacks, more confident in defense, more likely to survive because they fought as if survival was possible. After the war, as historians began analyzing American tank performance in Europe, the sandbag phenomenon became a footnote, occasionally mentioned, rarely examined in depth. The March 1945 test at the 1st Armored Group provided the only systematic data, and that data was inconclusive. Sandbags failed against side hits. They might have helped against oblique hits on the glacis, or the glacis might have been strong enough anyway. The report's conclusion about morale effects became the standard interpretation, but this interpretation, while probably correct, misses something essential about the sandbag story. The phrase morale factor suggests that the bag's only value was psychological, that they were essentially a placebo that worked because men believed they worked. This is too simple. Morale isn't separate from combat effectiveness. Morale is combat effectiveness, or at least a crucial component of it. A tank crew that believes it has a fighting chance will maneuver more aggressively, aim more carefully, maintain better situational awareness. A crew that believes it's driving a death trap will be more cautious, more likely to bail out prematurely, more prone to panic under fire. If sandbags improved crew confidence, even 1%, and that 1% translated into better tactical decisions, then the sandbags worked, regardless of their physical protective properties. This is the part of the story that engineers and historians sometimes miss. War isn't conducted by machines. It's conducted by human beings operating machines, and human beings are psychological creatures whose performance depends on belief, hope, fear, and the sense that they have some control over their fate. The Sherman tank crews who welded sandbags at 45-degree angles weren't engaging in superstitious ritual, though elements of ritual were certainly present. They were taking rational action based on incomplete information in a situation where doing nothing guaranteed continued vulnerability. They were engineers without engineering degrees, experimenting with standoff distance and oblique angles and disruption of shaped charge jets. They were soldiers doing what soldiers have always done, adapting to threats with whatever resources are available. Did they deflect 88mm rounds? Almost certainly not. The title's suggestion is hyperbolic, the kind of dramatic claim that makes for good storytelling but poor history. An 88mm armor-piercing round carried so much kinetic energy that sandbags might as well have been tissue paper. German guns could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Sandbags changed none of that fundamental reality. But did they occasionally, under specific circumstances, disrupt Panzerfaust warheads enough to prevent penetration? Maybe. The March 45 test suggests this was possible when the warhead struck at an angle against the glacis, though whether the sandbags deserved credit remains unclear. Did they make it harder for German gunners to identify vulnerable points on American tanks? Possibly, if you believe the captured letter from the Panzerfaust gunner who complained about obscured aiming references. Did they give men like Sergeant Donovan and Sergeant Kowalski and Private Walsh the sense that they'd done something, anything, to improve their odds? Absolutely. And in a war where psychological collapse could be as fatal as armor penetration, that sense of agency mattered. The story of Sherman sandbag armor is ultimately a story about the gap between industrial warfare and human psychology. The United States built 50,000 Sherman tanks during World War II, an achievement of industrial capacity that no other nation could match. But industry couldn't protect every man in every tank from every threat. That gap between what the system could provide and what individuals needed created space for improvisation. Some improvisations worked. Patton's welded armor plates genuinely enhanced protection. Some didn't work. Tests showed sandbags failed against direct side hits. And some fell into that uncomfortable middle ground where evidence was mixed, results were inconsistent, and the question of effectiveness couldn't be answered with confidence. In that middle ground, men made choices. They chose to believe that sandbags helped, or at least might help, and they welded and stacked and hoped. They chose to add weight to already overburdened vehicles, knowing this would cause mechanical problems but accepting that trade-off for perceived safety. They chose action over passivity, agency over helplessness. Were they right? The question doesn't have a simple answer. If we measure effectiveness purely by the ability to stop projectiles, then sandbags were largely ineffective. A burden that degraded mobility for minimal protection. But if we measure effectiveness by impact on crew performance and overall combat effectiveness, the answer becomes more complicated. Units that used sandbags fought well. Crews that believed in their protection pressed attacks more aggressively. Whether the bags themselves deserved credit, or whether the psychological boost from having them was the real benefit, becomes a distinction without practical meaning. What we can say with certainty is this. In the summer and fall of 1944, and through the brutal winter that followed, tens of thousands of American soldiers wrapped their tanks in sandbags and improvised armor. They did this despite official discouragement, despite engineering concerns, despite unclear evidence of effectiveness. They did it because when you're inside a steel box that might become your coffin at any moment, doing something feels better than doing nothing. And sometimes, in ways that couldn't be measured or proven or documented in after-action reports, that something made a difference. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes. And in war, sometimes is all you get. Sergeant Michael Donovan died in November 1944, his sandbags unable to stop an 88. But Private Danny Walsh survived, his sandbags either saving him or simply being present when luck was on his side. Both men did what they could with what they had. Both believed, even if only briefly, that human ingenuity could tip the odds in their favor. They were probably wrong about the engineering, but they were right about the necessity of trying. And in the end, that's what the sandbag story tells us. Not that improvised armor worked well, but that men facing impossible odds still tried to improve them, still believed that intelligence and effort might matter, still refused to accept vulnerability as inevitable. The Sherman tanks came home after the war, most of them, stripped of their sandbags and makeshift armor, returned to the clean geometric lines that engineers had designed. But the men who'd crewed them carried forever the memory of welding torches hissing in Norman fields, of sandbags stacked by moonlight, of the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, a few inches of sand and burlap might be enough to bring them home alive. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But they tried. God, they tried. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.